上海，进上海，你是个不夜城，花丹青，夜山香，歌舞升平。只见他笑脸迎，谁知他内辛苦闷，夜生活都未了。
It seems to me that nothing so ruins an Oriental as to veneer him with Western education, which is apparently so disharmonic with their past that it destroys in them what was good in their own tradition without giving them what is admirable in ours. Karl Keller. On October 29, 1931, Karl Keller, a Boston accountant with a passion for collecting rare books, attempted to console his good friend Oral Stein. Stein, the British archaeologist whose expeditions along the Silk Road had brought him global fame, had just returned from his fourth and final expedition to Xinjiang. Unlike the first three, however, this one had ended in obstruction and disgrace. Chinese intellectuals in Beijing, indignant at Stein's refusal to share leadership of his expedition with a Chinese scholar, had successfully petitioned the government for his expulsion from the country. In response to the ugly debacle, Stein struggled to comprehend the drastic change in attitude among the Chinese who had once welcomed Stein into their country. Surely, his friend Karl Keller concluded, reckless exposure to Western education was to blame for spoiling the once pliable Oriental mind. Despite his bigoted gloss, Keller was not entirely off the mark. Of course, Western education had not ruined the Chinese, but it had convinced them of the desirability of treating their art and antiquities in precisely the same manner as the Westerners did. This meant the creation of a national museum which transformed the ways in which art and artifacts were viewed. Previously, all Chinese collectors, the emperor included, regarded art and antiquities as the embodiment of the individual virtue of their private owners. Now, however, they were viewed as a testament to the collective artistic genius of the Chinese people writ large. The old Confucian elite had seen such things through a culturalist lens. Anyone who admired, preserved, and shared the results of their inquiry into Chinese antiquity could acquire, transport, and dispose of their own collection without moral judgment. Stein referred to these men as representatives of old China. He liked them. By contrast, he referred to the Western or Japanese-educated intellectuals of the 1920s as representatives of young China. Stein hated them. This was because they viewed antiquity through a nationalist lens, whereas culturalism decreed the location of an artifact and race of its owner to be irrelevant so long as he appreciated and shared what he had acquired. Nationalism maintained the opposite. Appreciated or not, all that mattered was that an artifact remain within the borders of the state in which it was found, and that it was found by a scholar of the proper race. Much like in the Middle East, the end of World War I served as a call to action for the intellectuals of young China. Bitterly disappointed at the results of the Paris Peace Conference, during which Germany's colonial holdings in China were handed over to the Japanese, students and professors in Beijing marched in protest of the power imbalance in Asia. But here, the parallels with the Middle East end. Unlike in Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, or Iran, China would continue to be plagued by civil war and foreign invasion for another 30 years. What were the implications of all this for foreign archaeology in China? Above all, it meant that the first, second, third, and fourth priorities of every politician in China were the restoration of domestic political sovereignty. In other words, Chinese politicians were consumed with the confrontation of other Chinese warlords or the Japanese. They had precious little time or resources to confront Indiana Jones. As a result, nearly all the frustrations experienced by foreign archaeologists in China during the 1920s and 30s would ultimately trace their origins to nationalist-minded individuals or organizations operating outside the auspices of the government. The central government, first in Beijing and later in Nanjing and Chongqing, was too preoccupied with self-preservation and non-stop warfare to take the initiative. Of course, once galvanized, both warlords and the Nationalist Party would make belated room in their political agendas for the concerns of nationalist scholars, but only if those scholars raised a sufficiently loud ruckus first. Unlike in the Middle East, politicians in China did not take the lead in matters of cultural sovereignty. For the most part, this noble task fell to university professors and their students in Beijing. Over the next 10 years, these men would take it upon themselves to remind unprincipled warlords and distracted politicians of their cultural duty to the new nation. In other words, they would shame their leaders into compliance with the new ideology of nationalism. The first showdown came in 1925. Langdon Warner, a historian of Asian art at Harvard University, came to China in hopes of removing a collection of wall murals at the caves at Dunhuang. He had already acquired a small sampling of frescoes on behalf of the Fog Museum during his first expedition the year before. Now he wanted more, convinced that the Chinese were not taking adequate care of the site. Unbeknownst to Warner, however, the Chinese interpreter from his first expedition had paid a secret visit to William Hung, the dean of Yenjing University. Wang told Hung about what Warner had done at Dunhuang the previous year. Hung mulled his options. Neither he nor Wang could do anything about the larger political situation in China, where a revolving door of warlords in Beijing routinely issued permits and visas to any foreigner able to make it worth their while. As a result, it was clear that nothing could prevent Warner from reaching Dunhuang. Once there, however, it just might be possible to restrict his freedom of movement. Hung decided to meet with Qin Fen, the Minister of Education, and asked him to send a secret telegram to all the local officials along Warner's route. In it, they were ordered to, quote, provide these friends with ample protection and courteous treatment, but on no account allow them to touch any historical relics. Their plan worked. Like Howard Carter in Egypt, Langdon Warner became the first victim of the new nationalist climate in China. In 1926, just 1 year after Warner's retreat from Dunhuang, the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin returned to China with the intent of mapping a trans-Eurasian air route through Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang for his Lufthansa financiers. To the Chinese, he framed his expedition primarily in terms of its archaeological and geological research agenda, proposing, quote, an investigation into whether or not airplanes could be used to survey the land. In response, Chinese scholars at several universities and research institutes in Beijing managed to organize a united front, issuing public pronouncements in the press expressing concern for the ultimate fate of any antiquities collected in the course of the expedition. In addition, they noted the glaring absence of any Chinese personnel among Hedin's ranks. The end result, hammered out over 6 months of grueling negotiations, was the formation of a joint Sino-Swedish Northwest Scientific Survey. Instead of only Swedish and German personnel, the survey now contained 5 Chinese scholars and 5 additional Chinese students. Not only that, but one of the Chinese scholars was appointed co-director of the survey alongside Hedin. The symbolic importance of such a power-sharing arrangement was unprecedented, both in China and the Middle East. Proud of its victory over Hedin, the Chinese government even issued a commemorative stamp of the expedition. Huang Wenbi, one of the Chinese archaeologists included in Hedin's survey, made it clear that henceforth the Chinese would be in charge. Our task was twofold, Huang wrote in his diary. On the one hand, we were to supervise the foreigners, and on the other hand, we were to carry out scientific investigations. The order in which these priorities were expressed was not a coincidence. Much like the King Tut effect, the Hedin effect resonated throughout archaeological circles in China. Hedin was the first foreign explorer to succumb to the demands of Chinese scholars in Beijing. Roy Chapman Andrews was the second. In 1928, having already led multiple expeditions to Inner and Outer Mongolia, Andrews was ready for another. He knew full well the fate of Hedin's expedition of the previous year and resolved to avoid its fate. Working in tight secrecy and shirking all public fanfare and press, Andrews' team slipped out of Beijing without being detected by the Association of Chinese Scholarly Organizations. By the time he returned to Beijing, however, the Chinese scholars had uncovered the ruse and demanded that Andrews share his finds with them. Andrews, a proud and arrogant man, could not imagine doing as Hedin had done, dismissing the Chinese scholars as, quote, returned students who absorbed a superficial level of Western culture and suffer from an inferiority complex. Andrews decided to withdraw his team from China. Walter Granger, a colleague of Andrews and a frequent participant in his expeditions, said that submission to Chinese demands would reduce the Central Asiatic expeditions to little more than, quote, Roy's charity organization. Langdon Warner, Sven Hedin, and Roy Chapman Andrews had all conceded defeat. That left only Oral Stein, the Silk Road archaeologist extraordinaire. Now approaching his 70th birthday, Stein assured his patrons at Harvard that he alone could succeed where everyone else had failed. He was certain that Chinese officials in Xinjiang, the last scions of his beloved Old China, would prove capable of deflecting any attack leveled at him by nationalist politicians in the interior. He was wrong. In the summer of 1930, after securing a passport from Chiang Kai-shek's beleaguered government in Nanjing, Stein prepared to scale the Himalayan passes into Xinjiang. At the same time, however, Chinese scholars in Beijing, now organized into a Commission for the Protection of Antiquities, learned of Stein's arrival and decided to issue a devastating press release. In it, 19 of the most eminent scholars in China accused him of having engaged in commercial vandalism on his first 3 expeditions. Stein's acquisition of 10,000 manuscripts from the cave library at Dunhuang in 1907 was described as a dishonorable act, one that Stein gleefully recounted in his books without the least shame. With that, the first nationalist salvo was launched. Other Chinese scholars soon entered the fray, calling Stein the greatest thief ever to plunder China's national heritage. Their attack on Stein bore immediate fruit. Now afraid of losing its nationalist credentials, Chiang Kai-shek's government hurried to cancel Stein's passport and order him out of the country. The duplicity and craftiness on display here is truly despicable, wrote Chiang Kai-shek. Send a stern telegram to the provincial government in Xinjiang that they are to observe and implement the many orders we have issued and expel him from the province. For Stein, the sense of betrayal was acute. As he left China for the last time, this time in disgrace, the old Hungarian deplored, quote, the obstacles which unjustified agitation has raised against the continued work of a confrère who has done as much as anyone to throw light on the great and beneficial part played by ancient China in the history of Central Asia. In Stein's eyes, he was a confrère of China, a colleague. The Confucian elite of Old China would have fully concurred with that sentiment, but the nationalist intellectuals of Young China did not. To them, he was a criminal, and the last of the foreign devils. This concludes our survey of Indiana Jones in China. Please join us next time as we head to Central America to explore the Mayan Mirage in Episode 17 of Indiana Jones in History.